He's so important, we had to fly him in on a secret plane that David Ferry Jr. piloted for us. He's the author of Mary's Mosaic. You're going to be blown away by this guy's presentation. I've heard him speak before, and again, I put him up there with John Barber. I put him up there with Art McClellan. I mean, Jim Mars. I mean, just great speakers. You're going to love this guy. This is Peter Janney. We're going to need a little bit of tech help up here. Somebody, here he comes. See, it's always a guy in a beard that is the tech guy. What is that? Musicians and guys in beards. Oh, here we go.
No, wait. Spoke too soon. Yeah, it's not good. Yeah, okay. That was easy. Okay, listen, I know you're all getting a little weary. This is going to be a little bit different in the sense that it's a little bit different story. I think most of you know my background a little bit. I did become a JFK assassination researcher. I was sort of drafted in by my own psyche. That didn't take place until long after I got out of college, and basically had lost my relationship with my father with a lot of heated discussions about Vietnam and what the hell was he doing in the world and what was the CIA doing in the world. And of course, this revolved around eventually a particular person who was murdered less than a year after JFK, Mary Meyer, who turned out to be having a very significant relationship with the president, a relationship that I would refer to eventually as a relationship of redemption. So I'm going to try and whiz through this as quickly as I can, because I know what I'm going to say is going to generate a certain amount of questions, and I firmly believe in giving you, the audience, the opportunity to ask some questions, because as you all know, there's a lot of material here. So in this new third edition, which came out in September, there are a couple of new things. There's a brand new chapter at the end, which I'm going to talk about. And there is a lot of discussion, or significant discussion, about this memorandum that the CIA had at the upper levels of its organization in September of 1967, right corresponding to when Jim Garrison brought on the investigation of Clay Shaw. So, you know, we might start out by just quickly asking the question, why does the CIA care what Garrison is doing? I mean, if they're so convinced that the Warren Commission was right and that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin, what do they care about who's saying what? Of course, we know the reason why they're caring. It's very clear there's been a profound conspiracy going on here, and they're very, very worried about it. Now, if you look at the date, this is September 20. This is the first of, I think, 3 or 4 memorandums that were held at the highest level. And this was actually, it was right after this date. I was home for a weekend from college, and I was just trying to make some small talk with my dad, and I said, you know, geez, Dad, I see that Garrison has opened up this investigation, and he's now saying the CIA was part of the involved with assassinating the president. At which point, my father just hit the roof. I mean, he became apoplectic. He was already an inveterate drinker, as most of those CIA guys were, but he went into a vicious tirade against me and anyone who would believe such cockamamie. And of course, what had just happened is that they had just had this first of several meetings, and you can see the people who are at this meeting are really, I mean, it's the cast of characters. They're the Inspector General, the Executive Director, and of course one figure here, Ray Rocha. If you don't know who Ray Rocha is, he was Jim Angleton's chief lieutenant in the Counterintelligence Division. Angleton himself didn't come to this meeting, but Rocha did. And this is what Rocha says at the meeting that is very, very crucial. You look at point 3. My father writes out, Rocha felt that Garrison would indeed obtain a conviction of Shaw for conspiring to assassinate President Kennedy. Well, if that's the case, this becomes prima facie evidence that the CIA itself was involved in the assassination of the president. And this is very, just right out in the open at a high-level CIA meeting. I'm surprised this memo got released, frankly, but it did. And so this has really, I think, gone unnoticed by most JFK researchers in terms of what its real implication is. I talked to 2 constitutional scholars about this, and I showed them a memo. We sat down, and both just shook their heads and just said, you know, this is political dynamite. I don't know, you know, what the CIA would ever do if they were, you know, brought before any kind of commission or any kind of an examination about this, but it's pretty damning. So here's the memo. The gentleman standing next to the memo, of course, is my father, a very formidable figure. You will see that, or you can't see it here because it doesn't, it's maybe on this side. You can't see his signature. Yeah, you can on this one. You can see that he signs the memo. He was chairing the meeting. And, you know, if you wanted to have a nightmare, of which I've had many, this would be the beginning of one of them. So I just wanted to bring this memo to your attention because I do think it's a very important piece of evidence that should never be overlooked in terms of its implication. It's quite damning, and as citizens, I think when we come to think about what our government is doing, again, this is what's called prima facie evidence. So that's part of the new 3rd edition. And the second part that I want to talk to you about is the person who is known as the runner on the towpath. His name is William L. Mitchell. And we're going to get into that now. As most of you know, Mary Meyer was murdered approximately 10 months after JFK. She had been spending the greater part of the year doing her own research. She had a lot of access to people in Washington. And of course, she'd been married to Cord Meyer, a very high-level CIA official as well, a friend of my family, a very dear friend of my father's. And Mary knew, of course, what the CIA was up to. Most agency wives didn't want to know and weren't told things, but Mary is an extraordinary human being. She and Cord had worked together before he went into the CIA in something called the United World Federalists, which was Cord's attempt to organize some kind of world government, a structure for world government that would possibly inhibit world wars and military conflicts from rising up too quickly, whereby they could be extinguished before any damage was done. Cord realized in the late 1940s that this was never going to happen. He got very depressed, started to get more alcoholic. It's at this point that his father got him an interview with Allen Dulles, and Allen Dulles seduced him as he seduced many people to join the CIA. A lot of the early CIA people were World War II veterans. They were highly educated, fairly well off financially, and they were looking to do something different. I mean, they could all go into their family businesses or live on their trust funds, but here was an opportunity, according to what Dulles was telling them, to really have a great positive impact on the world. And they would be leading the charge, and they would be collecting intelligence. And although we were in the atomic age, we could do many, many things to keep any kind of conflagration from taking place. And this was really looked at as a great opportunity. Cord Meyer was one of these people. My father was one. Jim Angleton. Well, I don't know about Angleton, but a lot of others really were seduced by Dulles in this early group that began to work there in the late 1940s, early 50s. Now, one of the things that Mary did know about was something called Operation Mockingbird, which I think most of you are very well aware of. It still goes on today, in my opinion. But this is the CIA's attempt to, in a sense, take over the media, and to whatever extent they need to, control it. Mockingbird was a way for the CIA to generate public opinion, control public opinion, and of course, Mary was very well aware of what Cord was doing, and she didn't like it one bit, and it eventually was one of the things that just really drove their marriage into ruins. The recent quote that I came across was what Bill Casey, director from CIA to 81 to 87, said. He said, you know, we'll know that our program is working, our program of disinformation, when it's complete, when everything the American public believes is false. And of course, that is a documented statement that Mr. National Security Apparatus was still controlling the media, and I feel certain that they are, particularly whenever they need to. So, more than ever, correct? So, let's go back to the murder here. This was kind of like a carbon copy of what took place in Dallas. I mean, that was a very successful paradigm as far as the agency was concerned, and so they generated something pretty similar less than a year later. This guy, Ray Crump, was set up to be a patsy. We can go into that a little bit later if there's a question about it, but my general sense about this is that on the day that they decided to take Mary out, it was a Monday, and they knew her routine. She'd been under surveillance for weeks. She was under surveillance because Mary had made it clear to several of her friends that she intended to go public. She had bought the paperback abridged version of the Warren Commission. She looked at it, she read parts of it, and she was deeply troubled by it because she knew it was yet again another cover-up. And she felt that the best thing that she could do as a citizen was to come out into the public eye and say who she was and what her relationship with JFK had been. And of course, she had spent the whole year thinking about this and doing research. She kept a diary with a lot of that information in there, as well as, you know, notes about their affair. And so the decision went down, as I understand it, to take her out. Her ex-husband, Cord, was in favor of it as well. They conveniently made sure that he was out of Washington that day, which he was. He was up in New York. And Mary had a routine. As an artist, she would go to her studio every morning, work for several hours, then long about noon, she'd walk down into Georgetown and walk out the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal and walk out to a place called Fletcher's Boathouse, about 1.25 miles out, turn around and come back. And so on this particular day, she followed her routine, And this is when the actual murder took place, approximately 12:22 afternoon that day. Now, lo and behold, the very next day, someone shows up at the police station. His name is Lieutenant William L. Mitchell. And he tells police that he would been taking his usual noontime run on the towpath, and he believes that he had run past this woman right before she was murdered. And then, of course, his next sentence almost immediately was, and oh, by the way, there was this black guy following her. And this is what he was wearing. And of course, he reels off the description of clothes that exactly what the defendant, Ray Crump, had been wearing the day before when he was arrested. So the police look at this fine, upstanding young officer, Pentagon officer, doing his bid for his country in the Pentagon, and say, wow, this does it. This closes the case. We also have the testimony of Henry Wiggins, the tow truck driver, but he's black. And of course, in Washington at that time, that wasn't totally a bad thing, but it's now they've got two people, one who's black, one who's white, basically identifying this guy who supposedly was standing over the body right after the second shot was fired. And the police are very excited about this. They look at this as pretty much an open and shut case. Crump is arrested, of course, and he is put in jail where he waits approximately 9 months to go to trial in July of 1965. So when I came to really understand what was going on here, the real mystery person at this point was Bill Mitchell. And when I went to press in April of 2012, I couldn't find him. We had spent, me and my research team, I had spent several years. The author before me, who I befriended, Leo D'Amour, had spent another couple of years, and we could not find Mitchell. He was not locatable. He wasn't in the National Records Center data profile. We couldn't get any Army records on him. So I figured that this guy's probably dead. He's probably just not in the picture anymore. There was, according to author D'Amour, a phone call made in March of 1993. Leo D'Amour had written to Mitchell at his last known address, which turns out, by the way, to be a CIA safe house. And of course, several months later, he gets a phone call late at the night, and allegedly it's Mitchell. We don't know whether it was Mitchell or not. Mitchell denied that it was when I deposed him in January of 2014, and we'll get to that. But in other words, Mitchell tries to give D'Amour some information, or whoever is calling tries to give D'Amour some information, some of which is incorrect. And of course, that would make D'Amour look terrible if he decides to publish it. But he never gets that opportunity, and we'll say why in a minute. In any case, Mitchell testifies at the trial, and he becomes the prosecution's star witness because the tow truck driver, Henry Wiggins, her testimony has been discredited by this attorney, W. Roundtree, who turns out to be a real hero. And she is convinced that Crump just couldn't have done this. He's not capable of a crime like this. So what happens is that Mitchell, because Crump gets acquitted, Mitchell disappears immediately after the trial. We don't know where he went, except we find out later, when I was able to finally figure out what Mitchell was up to, that Mitchell had gone to Cornell in 1957. He earned the 5-year Bachelor mechanical engineering degree, which is a very prestigious school. And of course, the interesting thing is there are never any pictures of Mitchell in the Cornell yearbook. There is, however, a picture of his section class at the Cornell University Engineering School. And you can see he is number 76 right there. He doesn't look that like that much anymore, but that's what he, I think I got it over here. That's what he looked like then. So what happens is we began to see a pattern here of how the CIA was recruiting people in college. And one of the ways we saw this pattern is what happened with Bob Gates. Most of you, of course, know all of you know who Bob Gates is. He was head of the CIA. He was also Secretary of Defense. Very clearly that he was recruited in college. He still had to fulfill his military service and did so. Became a commissioned second lieutenant in the Air Force. But then he did his 2 years, and then he's just zipped over to Langley and began doing, you know, what he did. So the parallels here is that, you know, Mitchell graduates from Cornell in '62. During that time, he's what's called a distinguished military student. He's in the ROTC program there, and he becomes a commissioned officer. And we finally learned through the National Personnel Records, after we located his military service record and his military service number, that, you know, what his date of birth was. We got to his social security number. The interesting thing is that he says that he's a Fulbright scholar and went to the University of London. Well, the Fulbright program has no listing of him as being a Fulbright scholar. This was kind of a ruse. I think what they tried to do is that after the trial in July of '65 didn't end up as they would have liked it to, is they shipped him out of the country very quickly, because he would have stood out like a sore thumb as to why this guy, Crump, was not able to be convicted. And so no one knows where Mitchell is for a while, of course, until he comes back. So he comes back, he earns a PhD in mathematics from Cal Berkeley. He then starts teaching at Cal State Hayward. It goes into the business school. But lo and behold, Mitchell decides to change his name from William L. Mitchell to just Bill Mitchell. And if you're looking for someone named William L. Mitchell and you can't find him anymore because he's changed his name to Bill, he's just laid out a whole new layer of anonymity, which makes it very difficult to find. Now, why did he do this? What was going on at this time? Well, the church committee was getting underway. Several years later, the House Select Committee on Assassinations got underway, and I think the agency was deathly afraid that if they start to do an examination of Mary Meyer's murder, Mitchell is going to be highly sought after, and they did not want him found. So William L. Mitchell becomes Bill Mitchell, and what happens is that he has a second social security number, which we located, that he uses from time to time. He fulfills his teaching job at Cal State Hayward, but he leaves as an emeritus, and of course his emeritus is right up there in red in terms of how he's now listed in any Cal State directory. No more William L., just Bill. So, when I decided that it was time to pay Mr. Mitchell a visit, I had to think about several things, one of which was my own safety. I felt that I had come all this way, and in the interest of the story, I had to do justice to the fact that I had to at least make an attempt to talk to this guy. So on August 27th, I attempt to go to his house, which I've located, and introduce myself, and this is what happens. Whoops, no sound. Well, that's too bad.
I can fix it.
Call the tech. Well, okay.
See you later.
All right, here we go. Let's start it again. Whoops. Try again. All right.
Mr. Mitchell? My name is Peter Janney. I'm an author. I wrote this book called Mary's Mosaic. I'm not interested. See you later. Could I just talk? No, I came from Boston. I don't care. I'm not interested. See you later.
So, Mr. Mitchell isn't interested in talking to me. I can't imagine why. But the point is that I now know he is alive, and he's very upset at the fact that someone like me has found him out. So the next question is, okay, how am I going to flush this guy out? I just can't walk away from this. And someone introduced me to the attorney Bill Pepper, who I think most of you know who he is. And I had lunch with Mr. Pepper, told him the story, gave him my book, asked him if he'd read it and just give me some advice how I might proceed. And Mr. Pepper said, you know, what you need to do is to file a civil lawsuit in Washington, which we did. And we need to, you need to flush him out that way. We, identified me as a special interest plaintiff who had been traumatized by the death of Mary Meyer, because after all, she was my best friend's mother, and my best friend had been killed, and Mary was instrumental in helping me manage my grief much more than my own parents were. And so I had another psychiatrist friend of mine do a workup on me, and in a sense write an affidavit that would tell the judge that, look, this guy deserves to be heard, and the court deserves to make him a special interest plaintiff in this case. Now, the problem, of course, we served Mitchell, and he was very upset that he got an attorney. The attorney called Pepper was very intimidated by Pepper, and Pepper told him, we will win in the primary hearing, and Mr. Mitchell will have to come to Washington, D.C., and that's how it's going to turn out. So there's a lot of wrangling going on, but there's also another problem. I don't have, at this point, Bill Mitchell's military service records. I haven't been able to get them. I don't have his military service number at this point. So I begin to think about what's going to happen if I walk into court and Mitchell shows up and pulls out of his back pocket his record, says, here, Your Honor, here's my record. I have no intelligence connections. You can look for yourself. I don't know what this is all about. That would mean if the judge bought his story, the case would be dismissed. Mitchell would wave goodbye to me smiling, and case closed. That would have been the end of it. It just so happens at that point that Mr. Mitchell's attorney, in making an 11th hour stand, calls my attorney and says, look, would Mr. Janney consider having a legal deposition with Mr. Mitchell? If he'll drop the case, we will submit to a legal deposition. And Mr. Janney can ask him any question he wants about the murder, where he was, who he was, everything. And so I thought about this long and hard, and I figured, this is a good idea. Because if I go into a Washington courtroom, court transcript as well, there's this mysterious other runner in Bermuda shorts that never comes forward, nor did the young white couple. I think it's very easy to conclude that this was kind of like a little Mission Impossible kind of scenario, where everyone had their role, and Mitchell's role was to go to the police the next day and finger Ray Crump as the murderer, which he did very successfully and almost was successful in the outcome. But I don't think at this juncture that there's any instances of Mitchell really having the kind of training and experience to be a CIA assassin. So the other thing that goes on after the deposition is, having procured Mitchell's military service number, I then hired a real sharpie of an attorney, a First Amendment attorney, to go after the U.S. Army and the National Personnel Records Center to get these records. They are mine in terms of what the Freedom of Information Act allows, and I knew those records were there, even though for years they kept telling us in one way or another, we have no records on this guy. Finally, my attorney, David Bodley, calls up the Army Chief Counsel, who he knows a little bit, and he says, look, I'm going to have to file a lawsuit against you in the next several days. You know my record. I've never lost a case in this kind of thing. Please remember that the last case we did, I walked away with over $300,000 in legal fees, and I plan to do on something similar as this. And they exchanged pleasantries, and then 2 days later, a call comes back from the Army Chief Counsel's office and says, oh, Mr. Bodney, by the way, we found the materials that you've been looking for. They were put in another place, but we finally found them, and you know, everything's going to be great. So they sent us quite a bit of material. And from this material, I was able to, with my research team, put together kind of a profile of who Bill Mitchell really was and what he was up to. Now, there are 3 documents here that I'm going to show you that I think are in the smoking gun kind of category. Okay, the first document is Mitchell's oath of office. This was signed on June 11th, 1962, the same day that Mitchell graduates from Cornell and then walks across the street to his ROTC ceremony and gets commissioned as an Army lieutenant. The only problem with this is that this document is signed in Suitland, Maryland, and this is where Mitchell had this document signed. He's in Suitland, Maryland on the day of his graduation. What's in Suitland, Maryland? Well, it just so happens that the Suitland Federal Building, across the street from the place where this guy, Martin Hughes, where's his signature? Oh, you can't see it over here. It's on this one. This guy, Martin Hughes, signs this document. Now, across the street is the Suitland Federal Building. It houses a secret office of the CIA, as well as several other offices of the Office of Naval Intelligence. There's an Army intelligence office there. But this guy Martin Hughes turns out to be the owner of a used car dealership across the street from the Suitland Federal Building. So it appears that Mitchell was having an interview or doing something on that day. Why they asked him to come down there that day, I don't know. But, you know, he said, look, I've got to get this signed. Oh, look, you can go right across the street to the used car lot over there. This guy, Marty Hughes, will sign it. You'll be fine. And that's what happened, okay? Now, the second thing here is what's called Special Order 219. This is an order that orders Mitchell to the Army element of the Defense Intelligence Agency. After telling me for 10 or 15 minutes during the deposition that he had no association with any kind of intelligence part of the Army. It's claiming again and again, oh no, I never worked in any kind of intelligence capacity. Here is the document that shows that he has orders from the DIA to report there for a certain stint of duty. And then finally, here is his locator card. Now, the locator card for Army people is that when you report to a base and they record your presence, they make out a locator card with your name on it. And of course, right here, you can see that it's got the Defense Intelligence Agency. This is Mitchell's right here. This was in late September 1963, and it's pretty clear that Mitchell was there. So, coming to the end here, I put together this final chapter, and of course one of the people who's been working with me for like 8 years is this guy, Lieutenant Colonel Roger Charles. Did any of you see the movie Truth with Kate Blanchett and Robert Redford? Well, Roger Charles is portrayed in that movie by, what's his name? Who's the movie actor? You know, well-known guy. But Roger was Dan Rather's chief research assistant for the George Bush Air National Guard fiasco. And so he's a very well-known guy. He's thought of very highly. And finally, after hanging out with me in the way that he has, you can see Roger comes to his own conclusion where he says, I no longer have any doubt now that Mitchell was working in some capacity for the CIA. And if Roger says that, he feels certain, based on the evidence that he has seen, that this is the pattern that is taking place. So, questions. This is really, what I've given you is just sort of the reason why I had to go back and do one last edition of this book. This last chapter where I decipher who Mitchell is and what he was doing is a very important part of the situation. It legitimizes what I say in terms of really supporting the fact that the CIA was behind her murder, and I think there just isn't anything more for me to do now in terms of research, and I really don't plan on writing another edition or putting together another edition anytime soon. Question? Yes?
Mr. Janney, thank you. There was a book called A Very Private Woman, which I'm sure you're aware of.
Nina Burley's book.
Yeah, that actually sort of raised more questions than it answered, but you seem to have tied it in. I have just two quick questions. Even though I know Cord Meyer wasn't in town at the time, I always wondered, with his background, if he could have had much more to do with the actual assassination of Mary Meyer. And what are your thoughts on that? And second, so if I'm understanding correctly, like you said earlier, LBJ didn't have an ongoing 50-year program to cover up, the mob didn't, but the CIA does and still does.
I didn't quite understand your second part of your question.
That there's sort of one entity that has an ongoing program of covering up or social massaging, since they own printing houses.
Okay. Well, the answer to your first question is, I do think Cord Meyer was involved insofar as he knew about what was going to happen, and he agreed with his colleague Jim Angleton and a couple other people that this had to happen given what Mary was about to do. I mean, you have to remember that Mary was a very well thought of individual in Washington, D.C. This is not some fly-by floozy who would get up and make a statement and people would just poo-poo it. She would have been listened to. People in Washington would have taken notice of her. She was highly regarded. As I think I make the point in the book, I don't think it's any accident that Philip Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, allegedly committed suicide in August of 1963. He had turned cool on the CIA. He was a very close friend of Mary Meyer's. If she had gone to him and said, Phil, this is all wrong, there's a story here, you need to look at this, he would have listened to her. And so I think already back in August of '63, the plans are being made. How are we going to deal with the media? And were someone like Phil Graham, could we not just eliminate him very quickly, given his sort of alleged mental instability, and get that little, rat out of the way? Yes, sir.
What's your opinion on Cord Meyer's role in the JFK assassination?
I don't have any evidence to point to, but I feel strongly that he obviously knew about it. I don't know what his role was, but I do think it's highly likely he was part of it.
but I have no evidence to base my that assumption on.